everyone. My name is Jennifer Lentfer, and I am the creator of howmatters.org and a member of the Healing Solidarity Advisory Circle. I'm really glad and grateful to welcome my friend Kristie Lockhart today to a conversation on welcoming new kinds of fundraising practices into the global development sector. I asked Kristie how she wanted to be introduced. She said, my bona fides are my bona fides, but really what's most important about me is that I want to help reform fundraising and think about how we drive more resources and funding to community-led work and solutions to poverty. So here we are. And I'm so glad to have you. Welcome, Kristie.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for that very warm introduction. I'm so happy to be with you today. I wish we were together in person in our usual Friday wind downs, but here we are, and I'm looking forward to, as always, thinking through things about how we can work together and with other people and other communities to really reform and create new paradigms in global development.
Totally. So to that subject, you wrote earlier this year about racial equity and fundraising, and what are the ways that fundraising can actually advance racial justice at this time. So what do you think fundraisers can and should do differently, either in their work with donors, either as institutions or as individuals?
Yeah, I wrote that article really out of a sense of bewilderment and frustration. I wrote it, I was watching to see this really dynamic action that was taking place from nonprofits and really transitioning and mobilizing themselves to respond to COVID. And at the same time, you have the Black Lives Matter movement just really galvanizing here in the US and then all over the world. And I'm not seeing that same response from my fellow practitioners in our community. And I was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why does race seem to be almost like the last bastion of just something that we just refuse to talk about? I remember having conversations at some of the organizations that I've worked with around sexual harassment issues, and people sort of talk about that with the freeness. And there is sometimes a very open space, I think, a safe space that's provided by organizations to talk about some of these other issues. But I have a sense that race is that last thing that is just sort of off limits for so many people. And so I think, first and foremost, the first thing that organizations should do is acknowledge it. It doesn't, and embrace it, right? Race is a part of the diversity, is a part of the fabric of who we are as human beings. You can't avoid it. So this fact that we are constantly avoiding it is just beyond me. And not avoiding it doesn't mean posting up a Black sign on one day. It actually means really committing yourself to doing the hard work we need to do to embrace it as a part of our systems, our way of thinking, of how we want to shape our organizations and our work. So I would say the first thing that organizations need to do is really take an assessment, right? Really look at their structure, look at their boards, look at their staff, and do an assessment of their diversity. I'm constantly shocked by the number of organizations that are 90% or above homogenous. In this day and age, in the global development community, if you're working at an organization and you don't have a person on your team that looks different than you, and you're not questioning that, we have a big issue. Mm-hmm. That really shouldn't exist today. It's just ridiculous. Mm-hmm. I really don't understand how organizations can continue to operate in this manner without making those sort of self-reflections and how they're structured and how they are staffed, and because that shows up in your work. I mean, we can say, oh, well, we're different, we're do-gooders, and we're doing things for the good of the people. But the reality is, you show up to work as who you are as an individual. So if you don't have any other people who look different than you or come from different ethnic backgrounds or economic backgrounds as part of your social network, how is it that you can justify using your position of privilege, using your, in terms of your work, as well as in terms of your identity, to go and help communities that are thousands of miles away? It just baffles me that people in 2020 still think this is okay. So the first thing that organizations need to do is really look at that, and then look at how can they start to develop strategies for how they can address that. Like looking at not just the recruitment process, because recruitment is one thing, right? When you can recruit people, some people that you think are diverse, but you want to make sure though that this is not virtue signaling, that this is not sort of tokenism, because the reality is, I think effective diversity inclusion means not only are you recruiting them, but you are really proactively encouraging them to share their thoughts and ideas. Because if you're really committed about diversity, you want diversity because it's bringing in diverse ideas. So if you're not creating that space for them, and it needs to be a safe space for them, then it's pointless. Mm-hmm. So I think, there's a lot of hard work that organizations need to do in order to be able to really to address these issues internally. And then from a fundraising perspective, there's another really, really difficult piece that I think needs to happen, and educating donors, right? And helping to shift the mindset of donors. And I'm speaking of donors at all level. I'm one of those fundraisers who thinks that every donor deserves to be educated and treated with respect, and every donor's donation is valued. I don't care if you're giving 5,000, and I don't care if you're giving 5 million. Of course, the amount of effort and time that you're spending cultivating them differs, but your messaging and your communication shouldn't. And it should center around allowing, just as you allow your staff, when you're looking at having a really diverse and inclusive staff, just as you're providing space for them to sit at the table and share their ideas, the same respect should be afforded to the beneficiaries, the people that you're working with. Like, we need to figure out ways to, how do we bring those voices more into our work as fundraisers, in terms of working with individual donors, as well as in terms of working with major foundations and corporations. And then we need to really uphold those values, right? So we need to come to a realization and actually actively sort of actuate the fact that not every donor is your donor. So if you say that you're respecting of diversity and inclusion before you sign that contract, or and do that on-pack branding with XYZ company, you need to be taking a look at that company. Do they uphold the same values that you're trying to uphold in your organization? Because that's when you have a values-aligned partnership. And unless you have a values-aligned partnership, you're really not moving the needle on those issues that you're really trying to address. I don't want, and I hope that fundraisers and the sector doesn't become this sort of bottleneck of whitewashing donations, right? What we say and we do as a mission and vision of our organizations really needs to live itself in the partnerships that we develop, because the reality is partnerships are changing. And as the lines get blurred between, the more traditional sort of grantor relationship into true shared values sort of partnerships, where you're looking at how do we work together to solve some of these issues, and you're developing more sort of innovative financing solutions, who you partner with is critically important. So we need to be willing to not be so influenced by the fact that we have to meet our budget and our objectives. We also need to be just as focused on making sure that we are upholding our values and the change that we want to see in the world through the partnerships that we're developing.
Yeah, it always occurs to me that fundraisers can be so sort of focused on the target, the fundraising target, that the ends justify the means, like gets all fuzzy really quickly. And so this rebalancing of values as just as valid and just as important as the money itself, right? Like bringing a qualitative measure of partnerships is so important. Absolutely. we have a long way to go to get there. So, and here we are in 2020, where we've got so much anxiety, so much rage. Um, you know, in this outcry, however, there's this sheer energy to do more. There's people are more activated politically in my world than ever before, and that's exciting. But how do our global development organizations actually channel that and bring into folk? I've seen a lot of people say, "Oh, well, we're going to be so domestically focused that it'll be hard to raise money for international causes over the next year." But I don't know that that's true. Yeah. So
Yeah, yeah.
what would you say to the organizations that are wanting to meet that new demand to do more?
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I think that, what's really to me most interesting about that question is that if anything, if COVID hasn't said how interrelated we are in terms of a global community, then that in itself, I think, is a challenge, because we are, like, to think that what we're doing here in the US and by focusing your funds in the US is really going to do is really going to have that, like, long-term, like impact you're trying to have, and commit it to whatever whatever your cause is, or whatever program that you're working on, is just, I think, unrealistic. So I think that, again, going back to our job as fundraisers are also educators, right? Like, we have to be able to finally come to terms with, accept and embrace the fact that, in order to change our lives, we must be willing and make it possible to live by the contrary assumption that what is good for the world is also good for us. So we need to be able to ensure that these are the conversations that we are communicating to our donors, because the reality is, our donors aren't really, I don't think, thinking that way, right? Someone who is a donor and is committed to global development issues is not all of a sudden going to turn themselves inward and start only any funding to the US, because the reality is the US always has issues and problems. And so they've always been there. Yes, COVID has manifested some, made some things, has highlighted some things, and really manifested some key challenges that we have in the U.S. that really require greater attention and focus and financing. But there's still tremendous issues that need to be supported in the global context, and they have an increased implication on our lives here in the U.S. So, I know that there's various research reports have various degrees of sort of report outs on what's happening now. You have a lot of people saying that, our finances really aren't changing any much, or we've been great in terms of being able to manage the storm. And you have other organizations who are publicly being willing to share the information about the challenges that they're having from a funding perspective. But, I think that this is a dilemma that's always sort of been faced by donors who exist in the West. So, if you have done your due diligence and your job of, I would say, looking beyond the gift and looking at how are you developing and cultivating really meaningful strategic relationships with your donors and partners, then it's not easy, but it's going to be a bit easier to weather this storm and to really sort of double down on those relationships, and really even get more focused and strategic about how you are communicating your organization's value proposition, mission, and the critical need for the programs that you are doing to be able to help the communities that you're working with weather the storm, and how their support is needed now more than ever if they are still able to give. So I think now is really a time for double down within the global development sector community, as opposed to giving up. and really trying to, in my perspective, if they're not able to give now, then what are those communications and those other messaging that you're sending out to be able to continuously cultivate a very strong relationship with your donors?
Yeah, and in that vein of seeing your role as a fundraiser as an educator, given your bona fides, the fact that you've been fundraising in our sector for 15 plus years, let's say an individual donor comes to you and says, I didn't realize, a white donor comes to you and says, I didn't realize how bad it was. And they've been recently activated. And now they've understood the movement in a new way. They see the global impact, these modalities of supremacy that operate around the world. So they're really getting a sense of that scope, that scale of racial injustice for the first time, maybe even. What would you say to them?
I would do my best to help educate them. I would look, of course, I'm going to start with my own organization, and I'm going to look to see where there's opportunities to use the work that we're doing internally to help them better understand, right, this, not just the origins, but really what the current ecosystem really is and how this has perpetuated itself for so many years. And to be honest, when we were talking about earlier about people needing to think differently about partnerships, if it doesn't exist within my internal organization, I'm going to direct them to another organization that really has a stronger footprint, right? And has a much more authentic lived experience to be able to connect them. Because at the end of the day, this is about, and I view my role as a fundraiser, helping our donors to achieve their own strategic impact goals and their vision for how they want to see change in the world. And I'm going to use every resource at my disposal to make that happen. So, I think it's about making sure, again, that you're building those strategic relationships and partnerships with your donors. And I know this sounds probably pretty egregious to some people, and like, oh my gosh, I would never do that. But we have to really think about what are those larger, so broad, complex social issues that we need to change. And the only way we're going to change that is by having a diverse set of stakeholders and actors engage. So if you're not looking at those broader set of goals, if you're only looking at what are those really 3 or 4 sort of key program interventions that your own organization is doing, you're only focusing on that, then I think you have to step back and ask yourself, are you really fulfilling your mission? Because your mission is going to have a much higher level goal. And unless you're moving the needle on that, I think having that sort of self-evaluation is critical. And as a donor, as somebody who not as a fundraiser, now I'm putting my donor hat, I would be one who's really demanding those questions, thinking about, well, if you say you're working in this area, then why do we see the indicators going backwards? So then I'm starting to ask the questions, how are you using my money? And is my money being used as effectively as possible? So I think that we need to really strategically look at how and what we're communicating, and making sure that we keep our eye on the North Star, and we're really going after those really large system change that is needed in the world. And by doing that, yes, that means you might be working yourself out of a job. But if you're in the same community for 40 years and you're servicing people's grandchildren, then you might want to start asking yourself how effective you're being.
Well, and it makes me think about just the transactional ways that we treat donors. That's what's egregious to me.
Yes.
That we actually just assume positional power because of endowed specifically by money, and pretend like we are just like, please give us the money, when in fact they also have to be part of the change.
Right.
So if we're not educating them, we're not reaching out to offer an additional perspective that maybe goes against their savior narrative about what their money does in the world. And we have to be willing to challenge them. And I was on a webinar a couple weeks ago and somebody said, well, how are we supposed to change anything internally when we're still just trying to service the donors? And what an important question. I mean, it is an important question. I think as program people often feel like, oh, I'm doing another report. I'm doing another whatever. And the truth of the matter is, if we're holding those in relationship, if our donor relationships are solid, we should be able to turn to them and say, hey, we've got to make a change. Hey, we've got to shift directions. Hey, could you, like really being transparent about what is needed as opposed to fulfilling their needs, wants, and desires is the dance. And it needs to be a dance. It can't be a default to hierarchical power.
No, absolutely.
At the end of the day. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think as fundraisers, we need to acknowledge our role in that. Donor-centered fundraisers, the donor-centered fundraising theory was not created by a donor. We created that. If you create it, you're well, not always, but if you're created it, you're sort of like best suited to solve it.
Well, that's what I think about the whole philanthropy sector. Like, it's all made up. There's, other than the 5% every 5 years in the US, it's all made up. It can all change. This is our own reality we've created. So everything that kind of we're get into this rote, we have to do it this way. It's so not true. It's absolutely not true.
Exactly.
And I think what you said earlier is so important too, about not all donors are your donors, and to be prepared to walk away and to say no. And the bigger the organization, the harder that is, and there's more jobs in the line. I don't want to, pretend that's not a reality as well. But to treat donors like they have nothing to learn, that feels like the biggest mistake I see fundraisers make.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what I would want to see changed. It needs to be a dialogue like all other dialogues.
Right.
Okay.
And I think we need to be willing to engage them in conversations, not about what we think they want to hear, but about what they really need to hear.
Right.
Because, thinking about donor-centered and what that means placing them and their needs at the center. And the reality is that's not why the social impact sector exists. It exists for other people's needs. And as a fundraiser, your job is to be that connector between the other people's needs and the vision of the person. And the vision of the person doesn't necessarily, I think, mean that they envision themselves in this hierarchical nature. That's the ecosystem we created. They just most individual donors just want to do good, right? They just want to do good. They just want to give you their monthly contribution or what have you, and just do a little good. I think that there's a different strategy when you're talking about, some of the higher level major gift donors, which seems to be really the most, I don't want to say important, but the most engaged donor segment at this point, because that really offers a tremendous opportunity to have some very strategic conversation to shift some major funding, right, in ways that really could be impactful, and to help them think through and actually work with you to think through how you're going to address these issues and incorporate them into your work.
Yeah. Deeper solidarity includes paying attention to how our money moves.
Exactly.
And I don't care, again, how much money you have. It really does. It really is tied up for that, for me. Yeah. So what do you believe are some more sound and ethical fundraising practices? Because at Healing Solidarity, we want to sort of ground in the practice. Our sector is always up here. We want to take it down to the day-to-day, the actual work itself. What do you think are those fundraising practices that could support global development organizations to kind of do this work to move forward on racial or gender justice internally and externally?
So, a lot of these things are things that I've outlined in the article I wrote this past summer. But, I think it goes back to a lot of the things we've talked about today. We need to model equity and justice, right, within our fundraising teams, and within how we are talking about and communicating our work. I mean, this this lingering sort of blight on the fundraising community, on poverty porn. Like, we need to, those racist power plays, they just really must be completely abolished. We should no longer tolerate them. Or justify them. And, it was interesting, an organization that I previously worked for had a relatively recent issue about a poverty porn appeal that they had put out. And so I reached out to a couple of previous colleagues, and some other people who are really, like, I think they're pretty much leaders in fundraising sector, and they didn't see a problem with it because they said it raised money. So those sort of justifications and rationales really should no longer be tolerated. But it's hard, I think, and I wonder, when you look at most fundraising teams, fundraising teams really remain more homogenous than the rest of the organizations, right? You'll get more diversity in program units, finance units, HR. Fundraising is, I would say, probably the least diverse business unit or team in organizations. So I think to myself, if there were more people of different and diverse thoughts on these fundraising teams, would these things continue to happen? Would they be the ones who's stopping the consultant or in the printing press and the digital designer and saying, before you hit that button, I really think we need to really think about this and think about how we are framing people? Because in looking at this, I completely feel just deflated and disempowered. So, and although I don't think that this is really a problem that should be solved by this diverse staff team member, the reality is, if they don't bring it up, the likelihood that anybody else will is much diminished. So I think that, again, going back to making sure that you have diverse teams, skill set, and people on your team is really critical to being able to address these continual racist powering plays.
And frankly, diversify your donor base at the same time. I mean, there's money being left on the table if we want to make the business case for this. There's money being left on the table if you're just going after white donors only all the time, right?
Exactly.
And treating them like that, and that perpetuates a saviorism that's also harmful.
Yeah, no,
and that never gets interrupted. Right. Yeah.
No, absolutely. That's an excellent point. It's some other things, again, as we already talked about, looking at how do you build authentic and meaningful partnerships and relationships with your donors. And we have to act boldly, right? Like, this is a time for bold action. It really is. Like, this is a time to be willing to reset ourselves in a way. And I think at the end of it, if we can do that, if we can use this opportunity to reset how we function, how the things that we value and how we operate, I think that maybe there might be a little decline, but at the tail end of that, we're going to see significant, I think, increase in terms of resources as well, and support more broadly, and realizing and being able to implement the programs that our organizations support. So, I think we need to think about that. But this is a huge and very uncomfortable situation that organizations are in. But I think it's time for people to be uncomfortable and be willing and able to just sit with that for a while.
Let's just sit with it. Let's just sit with it. And then let's ask our donors to put their money where their values are And that's, I think, what you're really saying, big time.
Yeah, no,
If
absolutely.
they want to see change in the world and in their backyard, it's all the same. Like, while the symptoms of problems look different in different places, the roots are all connected.
Yeah,
We can actually talk about this in a global sense without leaving behind people's own lived experiences. And we can actually tell stories that link up how this thing over here is happening here and vice versa, because it's a global system of capitalism that we're up
yeah,
against. It's a
yeah, absolutely.
post-colonial world we're living in. Like, it is all connected, and it's a really good time to start to make those connections for people even more clear. And I think we, as organizations, we've done a lot around, like, here's the problem, here's an emergency, quick, right? We built the muscle for people to respond right away, to give their $5 right away.
Yeah.
But we haven't built up their muscle to think about long-term change and how that happens and how that's needed in the world.
No, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it really has to happen now. I mean, that's just so well said, because there's never going to be another moment like this. At least I hope. I really hope there's. I mean, I hope there's never another moment like this. I mean, sure there will be, but this, this confluence of all of these things happening at once. But even that fact, right? Even the fact that we have COVID happening and the disparities that it unveiled is a clear indication that of the inequities, right? That continuously just perpetuate within society. So it is all connected. And like if people are having a challenging time to understand that, it's our job to make them realize it.
That's what we can offer donors. We can offer them a pathway to understand how to use their privilege and how to use what history has offered their family by way of family wealth and opportunity to provide more equity for the generations to come. That's actually what
Yeah.
fundraisers can do right now. And that's a powerful, powerful function and position. So thank you for leading the way and sending out a clarion call for what fundraisers can step into in this moment. Thank you, Kristie, for all of it. We'll be sure to put the article that we referenced in this interview in your bio, and people will be able to reach out to you that way.
It's truly an honor, as always, Jennifer. Thank you for leading the work and doing the hard work that you need to do as the person that you are, and in your role, and leading and mobilizing, catalyzing change in the sector. So truly an honor, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
We do it together, friend. Thank you.
Yeah, it takes a village.